Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 19th Las Vegas Book Festival Virtual Book Week. My name is Scott Dickensheets. I'm the deputy editor of Desert Companion, the magazine of Nevada Public Radio here in Las Vegas. I'm part of the literary and programming committee for this year's festival, our first ever online edition. Thanks for joining us. I've got a quick bit of boilerplate to trot through, and then we'll get underway. The Las Vegas Book Festival is produced by the City of Las Vegas and Nevada Humanities. We couldn't make this festival happen without our sponsors, and we'd like to thank them for their support. The Las Vegas Review-Journal, 98.5 KLUC, NBC Channel 3, the Mayor's Fund for Las Vegas Life, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Nevada Center for the Book, Nevada State Library Archives and Public Records, and the Institute of Museum and Library Services. The Las Vegas Book Festival is supported in part by an award from the National Endowment for the Arts. So we're gathered here this evening to talk about the legacy of author Hunter S. Thompson, who wrote Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, among many other works. And what a terrific panel we've gathered to do this. Timothy Denevi is the author of Freak Kingdom, Hunter S. Thompson's Manic 10-year crusade against American fascism, as well as Hyper, a personal history of ADHD. His essays have appeared in the Paris Review, New York Magazine, Salon, The Normal School, and Literary Hub. He's an assistant professor at George Mason University. Rory Patrick Feehan, joining us from Limerick City, Ireland, is a Hunter Thompson scholar who has written widely on the author, including a contribution to the award-winning anthology American Political Humor, Masters of Satire and Their Impact on U.S. Policy and Culture. He runs the online Hunter Thompson community, Totally Gonzo. Margaret Harrell is the author of the recent book, The Hells Angels Letters, Hunter S. Thompson, Margaret Harrell, and the Making of an American Classic, as well as Keep Quiet and Keep This Quiet Too, which compiled her observations of and adventures with a number of cultural figures, including Hunter S. Thompson. Juan Thompson is the son of Hunter S. Thompson and the author of Stories I Tell Myself, Growing Up with Hunter S. Thompson. He graduated from Tufts University and lives in Denver, Colorado, where he works in the healthcare IT industry. So that's our panel. Please look up their works online, visit their websites, follow them on Twitter, buy their books whenever possible from your favorite independent bookseller. All right, our subject, Hunter S. Thompson, wrote a fistful of classic works, including Hell's Angels, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail in '72, plus a shelf full of other noteworthy books, from Songs of the Doomed to Hey Rube, from The Great Shark Hunt to Kingdom of Fear. In addition to journalism and commentary, his work includes forays into fiction and autobiography, and he's definitely generated a long shelf full of books about him, from biographies to anecdotal memoirs to serious literary studies and more. Okay, so why talk about him now? Well, of course, here in Las Vegas, there's never a bad time to talk about Thompson, who did so much to shape the city's meaning and image in the public imagination. But there's something else, obviously. We're in the final stretch of a super crazy election that has many folks saying, it sure would be great to have Hunter Thompson writing about this. Of course, many people have felt that way about every election as the stakes continually rise and the divisions grow deeper. But 2020, this one has so many satirizable characters, so many mind-boggling developments, and more at stake than ever. Not to mention the plague, not to mention a resurgent civil rights movement aimed at police violence, not to mention a gasping, dying planet. All of this apocalyptic fervor seems right in the middle of Thompson's strike zone. Just the other day, I saw a social media meme that seemed to sum it all up for me. Where the bleep is Hunter S. Thompson when we really need him? So can we start with a bit of a good-natured speculation about what he might have made of this crazy, insane year? That's open to anybody who wants to field it.
If I go first, maybe. I was struck by a quote that Hunter was quite fond of. He actually put it at the start of one of his letters collections and maybe one or two other books. It was an ancient Chinese proverb or curse, may you live in interesting times. And I think that certainly applies to right now, you know. He had such a unique political voice and insight into American politics and culture. I think he might actually have, if he was around today, he might really surprise us at the line into analyzing what's going on. You know, he was predictably unpredictable. And certainly it has all the ingredients right now, all the things that would concern Hunter, you know, abuse of power and the, you know, behavior of Donald Trump as president and the media's role in all of this. Just so many different dynamics. The rioting that's going on, police brutality. These are all things that Hunter were, you know, all part of his output throughout his career. So it really couldn't have been a better time for Hunter to be here to write about what's going on. I think what would interest me most to hear his opinion would be on the aspect of the role of the media and how the media are actually covering the events over the past 4 years. You know, it's one thing that's consistent throughout Hunter's writing, going back all the way as far as back as 1960. He was very interested in how the media was reporting on what the developments, whether it was politics or whatever. You know, there's a letter that he wrote in October 22nd, 1960, after the presidential debate that was televised between Nixon and Kennedy. And Hunter sent a letter to the editors of Time magazine, and he was really scathing in his analysis of the performance of the media in terms of the presidential debates, which is so timely right now. And he said that, I'm going to paraphrase him, but some of the words he used, he said that the press were like Cub Scouts, that they'd have, you know, Cub Scouts would have asked more penetrating questions of the candidates, and that the press behaved like trained SEALs, which I thought was very interesting. You know, we're talking 1960, and really has much changed since then. He was, you know, he said when you consider the fact that the presidential candidates were put in such a vulnerable position, that the lack of a kind of substantial questioning of the candidates' positions was just astonishing. And that's a theme that actually goes right throughout his writing, and particularly when it came to the 1972 campaign trail book. You know, Hunter went to Washington to cover the campaign, and he wasn't really concerned about, you know, the kind of trade-off between getting access to candidates and, you know, what you're going to write about them, and that fear that you're going to get cut off your access. Hunter, he wasn't really concerned about burning his bridges, because as far as he was concerned, he was only there to do this once. So it allowed him to kind of write in a kind of a cavalier fashion, that, you know, a voice unrestrained. And that was such a unique take that it really stood out at the time. But the other important thing to consider as well is just how much things have changed in terms of the platforms that are available today to actually do that kind of writing. Yeah, Hunter came along at a very interesting time for publications in America. You had Rolling Stone magazine, which was only after emerging as this kind of radical underground music publication. You also had Scanlan's Monthly, the editor Warren Hinkle. And editors like Warren Hinkle and Jan Wenner, they took risks in publishing and allowing Hunter to write this kind of stuff that I'm not quite sure those kind of people are around today, and certainly not those type of publications. Everything has become so, you know, safe and corporate, that I think now if Hunter was to have a platform for the kind of writing that he did, it would probably have to be on the internet. And again, that also is an area where you have things like deplatforming and all kinds of questions about censorship as well from tech companies. So it's an interesting time period, and we can only speculate on what Hunter would actually, what kind of role he would play, but certainly couldn't be a better climate for his type of writing.
I can say, I'll be short. I agree with Rory, especially about how interested Hunter was in the media. As you can see from Hell's Angels, he started because the East Coast media was not going in person to cover a story about the California motorcycle gangs. So he went inside. But I think thinking of today, he would look for what was missing again, what's not being covered, what is the angle that hasn't been taken, because it's not useful to do what everybody else is doing. And so he had the ability to go inside, but he also had the ability, parallel, to be at the same time outside, because he kind of split himself. For instance, he had Duke, who could say anything, the most outrageous thing. And he had himself, who could stand back and observe, who had a kind of philosophical mind, ability to translate that into observation. So I think today he could insert humor. I don't see people inserting humor like journalists. I don't see them. I mean, everything is so top decibel. And he wrote at the top decibel, so he would not do that now because everybody else is doing it. So they aren't interjecting observation, humor, the lasting perspective, the long distance view. I don't know how he would do it, but as David Streitfeld said, the New York Times journalist, Hunter would die to be able to cover this moment. So what I'm saying is, approaching it that way, I see him as doing this odd thing, being a healer. We need humor. We need that kind of perspective. That is healing. And I wish he would come and heal us.
Well, I think that's right on point, and it's so nice to be in conversation with everyone here. Juan and I were talking a few months ago about, this election and Gonzo Fest, which Juan organizes in Louisville, and addressing how Thompson would be covering everything we're seeing around us now. And one thing, Juan can expand on this more, he and I have been talking about for a few years now, is that the fragility of our system has never been more evident than it is right now. And it's something that Thompson wrote about. He wrote about how dissent can be silenced through violence. He wrote about the outsized power of the presidency. And he wrote about just how fragile and how easily corrupted the American idea can be. He always called it the Jeffersonian idea of representative government. And I think if he were around right now, many of the, it would be difficult for him to write about how many of the arguments he'd been making at different times in American history are kind of going into full scale view. We've never seen these systems tested the way they were. And he had such interesting responses to abuses of power. Margaret, I know you were in Chicago, or your father was in Chicago in 1968 when at the Democratic Convention, Mayor Daley's police force in a police riot beat up public protesters. Hunter Thompson was hit over the head and was right there. And so afterwards he went and really began to question, how do large scale protests affect change? What do you do when the president or the police chief declares an open assembly unlawful and allows police to move in and use deadly force to disperse peaceful protests? And so I think that all of the questions he was raising, often at times in a way that other people thought maybe gauche or over the top in the 1960s, especially within the journalistic corps, in the journalistic press corps, have come glaringly into view right now. And Juan, you can talk about this a little more, but it's a terrifying time. And I always wonder if it's been made more terrifying or less in regards to the fact that so many of the issues we're seeing exploited right now were raised elegantly by Hunter Thompson more than 50 years ago.
Some great thoughts, and Scott, thanks for including me in this panel and for the thoughtful questions. I have to agree with everyone else that trying to predict what he might have said is, impossible. And Rory, I like what Rory said about that he was an unpredictable guy, and I think right now, in such a extraordinary polarized time, Hunter was not. I don't think of him as being a partisan figure. He was an idealist, and he believed in the, when it came to politics, in what this country could be or can be, but he didn't have much respect for either political party. And I think right now, boy, we could really use his perspective, that is not just black and white. Because this partisan polarization does not help us to better understand what's going on. I mean, one thing that I have some confidence is that he would be outraged. I think, yes, a part of him would be thrilled to be taking on, such a clear, clearly outlined, injustice. But then I think he might also just be in deep despair. Maybe like going back and forth between this sort of righteous anger and despair that we hadn't learned our lesson, back in Nixon's time, and were not only repeating it, but seemed to be, doubling down on it. But I certainly agree with everyone else that I would really value his perspective. I wish you were here to give it.
I'm glad you brought up his idealism, because there's that great moment in the '72 campaign book when he says, how low do you have to stoop in this country to be president? And it's both like a really biting satirical punchline, but it's also B, sort of a howl of wounded idealism at all the sort of broken promise, implicit in the presidency. So, and I'd like to segue for a moment, if we can, into his writing. I think, 15 years after his passing, and decades down the line, I think what a lot of people seem to recall most readily about him is his satirical skills and his knack for invective. But I think he wouldn't be an enduring writer if he didn't have sort of deeper talents in terms of, like, the carpentry of his sentences, and his ear for the music of language, and his, I think one of his great underappreciated values is his reporting, his ability to and knack for reporting. So I know, Margaret, you worked with him on the Hell's Angels book, so perhaps you could lead off that part of the talk.
Thank you. And I want to repeat what Juan said about what a wonderful idea and opportunity to bring us together. So thank you so much. So I think in his writing, a couple of unusual things he did. One is he built to the pressure point, which meant that if he had a story in mind, he investigated it thoroughly. And then he didn't just sit down at the blank piece of paper and try, well, not unless he had to, but he wasn't just rushing to put it down on paper. If possible, he gave it time to churn around in his head. And this is very, very, which meant he does two styles. One, if you run to the blank piece of paper, you might stare at it. But one, if you let the energy and the ideas and all sides and everything that you've investigated and tape recorded, if you let it churn around and you try to give it a place to be digested and processed, then it comes out, but you're backed up against a deadline. And so I think I saw him in 1991. I saw the powerful energy he had that I hadn't been able to understand before, just how much energy he was walking and holding. But it was tremendous and very, very hard to hold. So he worked very hard. He went out and used his tape recorder, did interviews, was on the campaign trail, was with the Angels. And he knew his facts, and he wanted the truth or a truth. He looked very hard for an angle in, because he didn't want this big, broad topic. He wanted a tiny topic that he could play with, but he had first to know his facts, like somebody who does abstract painting but can do very well figurative, exact reproductions. And so, but this big thing to me was that he was able to master holding all those ideas, all that research, until the moment came when he was backed up against the deadline. Then he had everyone with him to let that material come out. And then the hard thing was, how on earth do you get it into a narrative sequence? Because it was so much. He always had too much material. So that's what I would say. One other really important thing. I was lucky enough in 91 to sit beside him while he was writing. I was on this little stool in the kitchen, and he was there at the typewriter. And I've never seen this written down. I don't know why not, but I'm going to try to demonstrate. So he loved the musicality, which you mentioned. When he was writing, he had music on, and his fist was going like this. Musicality of the music and the words going through his body, and then type, and then musicality. And also that created a sense of joy, It wasn't like this, I got to get it out, tightness. It was a looseness and openness to what was streaming through him, and this musicality with this rhythm that he was reinforcing with his fist.
Yeah, if I could add to that, actually, if you look at the public perception of Hunter, I think most people immediately gravitate towards Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It's his most famous work. That's the most popular image of Hunter and Raoul Duke. But a lot of people don't realize that Hunter spent a good decade working as a journalist prior to Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. That didn't just drop out of thin air. He had put in extraordinarily difficult work for a good decade before that, and he really struggled to make it in journalism. He was living in poverty for many years. He traveled all over South America reporting on what was happening down there prior to coming back and writing about the Hells Angels. And that's often overlooked, and that Hunter was a serious journalist for a good decade. That's where he put in the work. That's where he got his training. And if you want to understand the kind of journalist and writer and what Hunter wanted to achieve as a writer and journalist, there's a great quote at the start of his letters collection. Again, I always go back to his letters collection because it's such an amazing book, a double volume collection, The Proud Highway and Fear and Loathing in America. Just extraordinary writing, and I think in many ways could even be looked upon as his greatest work, funnily enough. But at the start of his first letters collection, The Proud Highway, there's a quote by Joseph Pulitzer, and Hunter had sent this quote to William Kennedy in 1960-61 when he was trying to apply for a job in Puerto Rico. And William Kennedy was an editor of a newspaper down there, and Hunter wanted a job, wanted to go to Puerto Rico. And he quoted Joseph Pulitzer. This quote is engraved on a bronze plaque outside the Time Building in New York, where Hunter had worked as a copy boy. And I'll just read it out because it kind of, in one quote encapsulates what Hunter was trying to strive towards as a journalist. So Pulitzer wrote, "An institution that should always fight for progress and reform, never tolerate injustice or corruption, always fight demagogues of all parties, never belong to any party, always oppose privileged classes and public plunderers, never lack sympathy with the poor, always remain devoted to the public welfare, never be satisfied with merely printing news, always be drastically independent, never be afraid to attack wrong, whether by predatory plutocracy or predatory poverty." And I think that's really what Hunter was all about. William Kennedy wrote back to Hunter and said, "Why don't you write a play about that quote?" Which wasn't the response Hunter wanted. So he replied and said that he was going to come down to Puerto Rico and jam a bronze plaque into his intestine. But that really just shows you the kind of serious journalist Hunter aspired to be, and for a good decade, that's exactly what he did. When he went all over South America, he was writing about things like police brutality, student uprisings, and that was his bread and butter for several years. And that prepared him spectacularly well for his return to America, where he promised that he was going to write what America meant. And of course, he saw all these horrifying things in South America. And when he came back, unfortunately, those things were beginning to happen in America. So it really was it prepared the ground for the kind of journalism that he brought to the table when he returned to America.
Timothy, what do you have to add on this?
No, I think all of that is fantastic. I think that he wrote in a way that brought to the surface not just the violence that journalists in America faced at the time when trying to report on corruption and out of control and powerful entities, whether it's the LA sheriff or the president of the United States. But I think he also, by putting himself oftentimes in harm's way, as most journalists do and don't oftentimes, he was able to show just how effective that violence can be and just how lasting something like the killing of Ruben Salazar, the great reporter in Los Angeles, in 1970, how effective it can be silencing an attempt to hold people accountable. And I think he's misconstrued as seeking out violence or being reckless. During this time, as Rory points out, when he was covering these mass uprisings in America, when he was investigating abuse of power at the highest level, he was a very careful reporter. He didn't want to get punched in the face. He didn't want to get beat up. You can't tell your story if your arm's broken. You can't, report on an abuse of power if you're in the hospital. That wasn't his goal. It wasn't to be martyred, or it wasn't to be reckless, but it was to get as close to that violence as possible as a reporter, and as many excellent reporters do, to be able to articulate how certain entities in our American civic structure are not playing by the rules that we've set up, and that these entities understand that if they can use violence, then there's no conversation at all, and there's no accountability, and that they can do what they want. And I was thinking about him. I was at Lafayette Square in June, and I left just before the police riot, but I could see all the police massing, and to see them gathering their tear gas, to see them, like coming together around the White House. It felt as if the air of being able to speak was going out of that space, and that is then what happened. And he articulated that so well in some of his best works from that time. The Strange Rumblings and Aztlan essay, especially.
One of the things I've noticed about when this comes to the pure quality of his writing, that uh, so many people who love Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas love it for the action and the sort of the things it depicts, but it wouldn't be nearly effective if like every sentence pretty much wasn't like so beautifully like constructed and laid in place. And I think it gets that sort of master carpentry quality of his prose gets overlooked a lot.
Scott, I was just pulling out my copy of the campaign trail, and this is actually this was Hunter's copy that sat next to his, at his desk, and it's where he made when he had like notes, or, like, corrections that he wanted to make for future versions. He'd make them in here. So I got this after he died, and it's so. And as you were talking, and as Tim was talking, you really got me thinking about, what made. I completely agree with what you've said and what people said about the craft and the musicality, and that's something that I think a lot of people assume that he just wrote, first draft and then sent it off to the editor, but that certainly was not true. I think with Hunter, it's not one thing. It's to me, it's his, it's that righteous anger and idealism that infused and drove what I think is his best writing. And it was, but it was that combined with, his intellect and his ability to really see things, see through the bullshit, and see patterns and realities that most of us can't see, and then combining that with his skill as a writer. And I was just thinking about the fact that he's called a journalist, but that doesn't really capture it, because that makes it sound like he just recorded the facts. And I think one of the key aspects of his unique style is that he combined the facts with the tools of the novelist, and I'm sure Rory and Timothy can tell me what the actual quote is, but it's something to the effect that that fiction can be more true than nonfiction, and I think that's what Hunter was. What he realized and was going for is that he could more clearly communicate the underlying truth of what was happening if he was able to take some liberties with the actual facts. And I just wanted to read something from Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, just as an example of both that idealism, that biting satire, and then the humor, which it's this just amazing blend of all three. So he's talking about Nixon and McGovern and how it's been such a clear choice during the campaign. There is almost a yin-yang clarity in the difference between the two men, a contrast so stark that it would be hard to find any two better models in the national politics arena for the legendary duality, the congenital split personality and polarized instincts that almost everybody except Americans has long since taken for granted as the key to our national character. This was not what Richard Nixon had in mind when he said last August that the 1972 presidential election would offer voters, quote, the clearest choice of this century, unquote. But on a level he will never understand, he was probably right. And it is Nixon himself who represents that dark, venal, and incurably violent side of the American character almost every other country in the world has learned to fear and despise. He speaks for the werewolf in us, the bully, the predatory shyster who turns into something unspeakable, full of claws and bleeding stringworts on nights when the moon comes too close. At the stroke of midnight in Washington, a drooling, red-eyed beast with the legs of a man and the head of a giant hyena crawls out of his bedroom window in the south wing of the White House and leaps 50 feet down to the lawn. Pauses briefly to strangle the chow watchdog and then races off into the darkness, toward the Watergate, snarling with lust, loping through the alleys behind Pennsylvania Avenue, and trying desperately to remember which one of those 400 identical balconies is the one outside Martha Mitchell's apartment. He could write, couldn't he? Man.
Oh, yeah.
And one thing that strikes me as amazing about that is that, as Margaret noted, he didn't just like dash to the typewriter. He held it all in his head, and yet that book was largely composed on a cycle of deadlines. So there was this weird tension between being able to write like that after like filling your head full of stuff, busting it out on deadline, and still have it come out like that. There's definitely a weird magic there. Timothy, your recent book took a close look at the role of politics in his writing, or his political writing. And it's worth noting that pretty much, like, no matter what his nominal topic, like, for instance, Hey Rube, which was a compilation of his columns for ESPN, a sports publication, politics is never far from his mind. And what role would you say politics plays in his, in his sensibility and sort of, as in the motor of his writing?
I mean, yeah, that's an excellent question. Margaret and I have talked about this a lot, and Rory and I talked about it too, about how Thompson was, like all of us, a product of his time and place, and that time and place included growing up in Louisville, and where Juan lives now, and feeling, in a sense, that he was treated as a young man unjustly, and that certain people, because they had more power, were able to avoid consequences that he then endured. And as he got older, as his experiences grew, at the center, for me, of his political was that, the idea that if this system is to exist, then it has to exist to hold those who are most powerful within it accountable for trying to use the same system to get away with whatever they want. And whether he's writing letters to LBJ about Vietnam, to the White House in the mid '60s, whether he's reporting on unrest in South America, about democracy dying in Peru, and whether he's on the campaign trail with the Washington Press Corps, I think that sense of abuse of power and of justice was at the center of his political logic. And so we can all talk about this. I think it's not simply a political ideology. It's also a very attuned and developed concept of morality that took time to sort of come to fruition. And I think that's why he was attracted to politicians like George McGovern and Bobby Kennedy, who I think experienced similar evolutions along the political and moral axes of their perspectives.
Juan, did his politics or view of politics or stance in politics change or evolve much over the years, or was he pretty, steady from beginning to end?
I think he became I mean, in terms of parties, no. I think he was always, went his own way. But I think he did become more, let's say more cynical, but I think less hopeful. The guys you just mentioned. I mean, Bobby Kennedy, George McGovern, JFK. Those were such symbols of hope, for so many people, and certainly, including Hunter. And I mean, the fact that he ran for sheriff, that was an act of driven by hope that maybe, just maybe, we can actually change things. And I think as he got older and saw, things going in the opposite direction, from what he would have hoped, the last significant thing was the reelection of George Bush, which was deeply, he was deeply depressed after that. So, and that's a tough thing, you hope for your these guiding lights to become wiser, to be able to share their hope. But I don't know that Hunter was able to do that, as he got older. I'd be curious to know what other people think about that.
If I could just add to that, if you look at Hunter's campaign for sheriff, I'm glad Juan mentioned that. I think it's quite telling that Hunter went on his own platform. He didn't try to run as a candidate for either party. He was quite fond of saying politics is the art of controlling your environment. And I think that particular sheriff campaign showed Hunter's desire that people become more directly involved in politics themselves and not wait for somebody else to do it. That if you want change, you have to go ahead and try and do it yourself and try to enact the change you want to see. I think it was very revealing that when he finally did run for sheriff of Aspen, because what was going on there was concerning him and his friends and family, that in order to defeat him, the existing party structure, Democrat and Republican, had to actually work together to defeat him. I think that's quite telling about American politics, really. There's actually, I know fans of Hunter probably aren't aware of this yet, but there's actually a new documentary all about that campaign coming out, Freak Power, the Ballot or the Bomb, it's called. You can see the trailer for it on freakpower.com, and it's out this month, and they've actually unearthed hours and hours of previously unseen footage of Hunter from that campaign for Sheriff of Aspen. And it's a fascinating look at what actually happened, because a lot of that campaign has, similar to other aspects of Hunter, people latch onto the more crazy aspects of it, the kind of entertaining platform that he ran on. But when you dig behind the scenes, it was actually some really interesting dynamic there going on with what Hunter was trying to achieve. In a weird kind of way, he was almost running on a kind of environmental platform, almost like a Green Party platform. Mm-hmm. He was concerned about development in Aspen and how it was going to ruin Aspen. That was one aspect of his platform, and he proposed, to counter that, changing the name of Aspen to Fat City, Colorado, because who would want to own a holiday home in Fat City? And it kind of captures what he was about. You've got that humor, but there was a more serious aspect underneath that. So I think, in terms of his political leanings, he was more kind of anarchist, libertarian, leaning than anything. But you know, he has an interesting record of voting. You know, he went with Ralph Nader one year. So I think the underlying aspect of his politics and his writing, how fiercely independent he was.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, he was very serious. He was a political junkie, as he said, but he was very serious about it, trying to make changes in the world. And the Aspen race, he was very serious about making it a book that would precede the McGovern-Nixon race. And he wanted to influence McGovern's campaign. He did not want McGovern to go with the party bosses and Humphrey and all those people. He wanted him to continue on his own path of looking for all the voters who never vote, the disenfranchised, the disillusioned people. But McGovern didn't do it. And he wanted this book on the his Aspen sheriff's race. He wanted that to come out as a book preceding the election, so it would have a political impact. He wrote me and asked me, I was in Morocco though, if I would help with this. And somehow, I guess whatever he did on the book must be in his papers somewhere. I don't know to what extent he had created it, but then he was kind of upended and went to Washington. But he very much, but he couldn't get McGovern to go along. But I want to, about his values and how they went throughout his life, I want to read this tiny little thing because I was very impacted. I always look for, as a young woman, I was looking for someone in males who were very strong in their sense of themselves, who knew how to be authentic, who would not back down if somebody tried to intimidate you. They wouldn't change their views unless new information came, and then they would be open-minded. And so Hunter was fearless in what he believed, and I wanted that quality. And I think everybody, that is Gonzo today. Gonzo community, they want to be authentic, they want to be fearless in whatever they believe, whatever it is. So he was writing me a letter, bright red ink, 1966, when I was a baby. And he was talking about a quarrel with Random House, or in specifically Jim Silverman. It was, you know, he wanted his money and so on. So we won't focus on what the issue was. But he was laying down the law to me. I was the intermediary to get his word into Random House. He said, and I'm surprised that you suggest that I should accept the same kind of cheap BS, he wrote it out, from Silverman that I wouldn't accept from Time, Newsweek, and the New York Times. I won 2 out of 3, and really 3 out of 3 on that score. And those issues were far more open to interpretation than my argument with Random House. And then, jumping ahead, he said, I didn't work all that time to destroy a structure of lies, only to become a victim of it. So he would stand for destroying structures of lives, and he was known to say about a politician, is he lying? is he lying? That would be a pertinent question. But destroying structures of lives, I think of him as being unafraid to take up that mantle, but doing it in a way that no matter how ferocious he was in his writing, you didn't come away feeling disheartened and down, and at least I didn't, because he brought enough humor and intelligence, thought, not just emotion, that and humor, the humorous angle, and making an active reader, not just a passive reader ramming things down your throat, opinions, that you came out feeling good when you were encountered anything he wrote. You came out feeling good. And I did not come out feeling good when I watched the channel news today. So for him, I want him back speaking for, telling us what he would do and say and think. Now, maybe he would start a Gonzo party. I mean, it's not crazy. And we could be vote Gonzo this year. How about it, you know? I would.
Me too.
Well, speaking of Gonzo, was Gonzo essentially a category of one? Because I mean, you would think that 2020 and everything that's happening now would bring out, any of his people we might think of as his successors, and yet nothing that really, I see not much out there that would fall sort of in the same line, same lineage as Thompson, other than sort of like weak attempts at sort of alternative humor or whatever, but nothing that has that sort of the same sort of satire and reporting and sort of moral compass that he exhibited. So I'm wondering, was he sort of a unique category of one, and is Gonzo otherwise sort of an ideal that nobody can reach?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I think to think of it as some kind of system or a set of rules that you can follow, and then you too can write Gonzo that's like saying, well, just follow these rules and you can write like Faulkner, or just follow these rules and you can write like Mark Twain. No, of course not. It's the combination of the elements. I mean, and did he, was he obviously really influenced by the new journalism? Yeah, I mean that was a key ingredient, but I mean he made it. That was just an ingredient, and then he brought together those elements of his intelligence, his passion, his incredible talent, skills as a writer, into his voice. So yes, I think it is. It's to say Gonzo is really just a shorthand for saying the voice of Hunter Thompson.
And yet, as someone who's edited alt weeklies, I can assure you that I received any number of resumes from young writers who said, "I'm Gonzo," and
I have no doubt.
And it was really just a strategy of putting themselves in a story so they could write, manic prose about it, without all the attributes that the actual Thompson would bring to it. So,
yes.
Which leads me to perhaps my penultimate question, which would be, this panel is about his work and not so much his life, but I do sort of want to ask if there's, what aspects of Thompson are not necessarily reflected in the larger, enduring image of him, the mythology that's sprung up around him. Like, what does that leave out?
If I could answer that, it leaves out the incredible hard work behind the surface image. Hunter, arguably you could say that his greatest work in terms of crafting something was not one single book in a way. It was actually the literary persona that he created that spans all of his work. It's a crucial aspect of also understanding Gonzo journalism, that he created this literary persona that he called it the Hunter figure himself. In as early as 1959, he used to refer to himself in the third person as, what next for the Hunter figure. So even then he was thinking about this literary persona that was kind of separate from himself as the author, and that how he crafted that persona and brought it into his writing, and then in creating Gonzo journalism, which became, a form of meta journalism, the story behind getting the story. He placed that persona at the center of that. And that's what a lot of people miss. So when you get somebody else saying, "Oh, I'm going to write Gonzo journalism," the element that's missing from their work is Hunter Thompson, who was central to Gonzo journalism. You can't take Hunter out of the story and still have Gonzo journalism. And a lot of that is missed. Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, certainly because of the movie as well, people latch onto that and they think that this was something that kind of happened by accident. But Hunter had spent, a good decade crafting not just the literary persona that you see in that work, but also the the kind of the stylistic elements of all of his writing, the humor, the rhythm, you know, there was an incredible amount of work behind his work. And there's also this kind of perception that I've seen it recently where people are trying to link Hunter with fake news, which I think is misleading as well, because, you know, Hunter was always very honest in terms of his dedication to the truth and being honest with his readers. He didn't just blatantly lie about things. He might present things in a way that's not quite accurate, but the end result is an accurate reflection of the story. You know, I think George McGovern described Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail as the least factual but most accurate account of that campaign. And I think that really, you know, says it all about Hunter, that he was honest with his readers and he was dedicated to the truth. And, you know, I think that's what his legacy will be, is how he was fiercely independent and uncompromising in his pursuit of the truth through unconventional means.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's outstanding, Rory. And, you know, I would add, and I've talked to a lot of you about this, but his political instincts during that time were really good. And that it's hard to be clear-eyed in the middle to late 1960s and early 1970s. He has a little line where he says, you know, let the record show that I kicked Richard Nixon before he was down. And it's not just that, it was his perception of what made politicians inauthentic and what was a liability to them. He had very good political instincts within local and national elections. You know, he could see, as Margaret brought up, when McGovern kind of tacked back to the center and, you know, tried to play to the George Meanies and the Mayor Daley's of the world to bring the Democratic Party together, that was an inauthentic move. And it was the wrong move politically, as well as what, you know, Hunter would say. I think that with time, with celebrity, when someone becomes a caricature, one thing we do is we give credence towards, you know, instincts that fit that caricature, as opposed to instincts that really work toward his intellectual and analytic side. And those instincts of what makes an American politician a good politician that can affect change and can, in a specific climate, push back against the corrupt and manipulative forces around them, is something that, in my opinion, has been lost and is as valuable as ever.
I would come back to what I hear an echo. I hope you don't. I would come back to what, can you hear an echo?
Maybe a little. Just go ahead.
Okay. So I would come back to what the beginning and the end for me is Hunter the human being, the presence. And now the echo's gone. So Hunter the human being, the presence. So whatever he wrote, whoever he was, it came from his presence. And he had enough presence. That means energy he could hold and translating that into ideas and to actions and so on. And also getting off steam because he had so much energy. So I come back to the presence. I remember him. And I will always remember him because of the presence he approached me and life with, the life force. And so that presence did write beautiful writing. It expressed itself that way. But before and all, I remember, I mean, he had a quiet side. And I saw him taking in facts or taking in impressions, not just immediately going out, being externalized. And he also internalized. A lot of people don't even notice, or they had no chance to. He also internalized. He could get quiet. I see him for that strong authenticity and that be here now kind of thing. He was here, and people won't forget it. And so when he wanted to be like Faulkner, Kilroy was here. You know, some people will say 1,000 years later, Kilroy was here. Faulkner wanted that. Well, Hunter, in both action and words, was bringing his presence here. And he left us something. And it's proven by the fact that we have enough of it that we can still pick it up and it be useful to us.
Boy, you know, just as we just touched on these different topics, and it just really just brings home that you know, an hour is enough time to just scratch the surface of Hunter and his writing. I hope anybody, you know, everybody watching this will you know, head down to your bookstore or get online and order a few books to actually see what this is all about. Well, so your question, you know, about Hunter as a person. Obviously, I've thought about this a lot, and obviously written about it. So my book is about is my growing up with him and the evolution of our relationship. I guess the first thing is I've thought a lot about, you know, there was Hunter the writer and Hunter the man, and as you know, as other folks here have pointed out, in Hunter's case, I think more than for most writers, there was a real blurring of the two because of his Gonzo persona. But for me, it's been really important to really separate those. That there is Hunter the writer, and Rory, as you said, you know, and I appreciate you saying it. He was so serious about writing from a young age. Like, you know, he's like 12. You know, he wanted to be a writer, and he just pursued that very seriously, really his whole life. And I think it's his books and his writing that will, you know, that will remain. That's what continues to inspire people. And my opinion is that the persona is, with its focus on the hell raising, the drugs, that's a distraction from what is most valuable about Hunter, which is his writing. So I've really had to distinguish. You know, there's Hunter the writer and Hunter the man, and you can't blend the two or judge one in terms of the other. You know, there are plenty of people who admire his lifestyle, but haven't read his books and don't understand what he's written. And there are people who really condemn his lifestyle and therefore condemn his writing as being, unworthy. And I think it's so important. I mean, in Hunter's case, and you know, with so many other people to separate, so many artists to separate the two. You have to deal with the man as a man and the artist as an artist, and you can't cross over and try to judge them in terms of the other side. So, I mean, my experience was that Hunter was a complicated guy. He was, growing up with them. I mean, the strongest impression was that he was scary. You know, he was big. He was angry. He was self-centered. He could be a tremendous asshole. You know, he treated my mom and other women in his life terribly. You know, he had a very quick and volcanic temper, which was, you know, for a kid, terrifying, and for other people, just like, God damn, get yourself under control, you know? But, I mean, he was also, you know, Margaret, as you said, he was incredibly sensitive and perceptive. And he could be remarkably generous. And Rory, you know, some of the letters, you see how, you know, if he had like, you know, $10 and, you know, some friend said, hey, you got any money? He, you know, he'd give him $10, you know. And, you know, and for me, he's also been very inspiring in his sort of, you know, writing arena. His courage, you know, is Tim, you know, that great quote of, you know, I kicked Richard Nixon when he was up. You know, that's you know, think about it. I mean, you know, you're writing this, you know, very, you know, deeply critical and insulting prose in a national magazine about the sitting president. That's a rare thing, but he did it because, you know, he believed it needed to be done, that this stuff needed to be said. People needed to really understand who this man was. And that couldn't just be summed up in, you know, well, he said this and he did this and he didn't do that. He had to draw the picture, you know, and a very vivid picture it was. So he was just a boy. I guess this is my final thoughts on it would be, on one hand, he has been very inspiring because he really wanted to, you know, live a life of meaning. And on the other hand, he was so difficult to be in relationship with as a human being, that you know, I have striven in much of, you know, to not be like him, you know, as a man. So it's a strange thing, and I think one of the things, you know, I came to, you know, through this evolution of our relationship was realizing that I didn't have to pick one. You know, he didn't have to be, well, you know, I'll just ignore all that other stuff, and, you know, he's an all right guy, you know. And nor does he have to be a complete, you know, a bastard with no redeeming qualities. He was both.
A very complicated figure, and certainly
Indeed.
one worth still gathering to talk about now.
Indeed.
I think we've used up our allotted time. I want to thank you so much for being part of this, for you know, dropping some knowledge on us and giving us all this insight. So, you know, Rory, Timothy, Juan, Margaret, thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Scott. Good to
Great
see you,
discussion.
everyone.
Pleasure.
Great question.
Pleasure is all mine.